This story is called Of Mermaids and Other Sirens. I wrote it following a vacation in the Gaspėsie some years ago, when we stayed at the town of Anne-des-Monts. Mermaids and Other Sirens. You see them along the first avenue of the town of Anne-des-Monts, sculptures en bois of the figures of mermaids. They're human in appearance from the waist up and scaly below, yet they have seal-like flippers rather than fishy tails. Mermaids look out defiantly, challengingly, their uncovered breasts pert, round and proud. Why here, I ask myself, along the southern shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence? The question nagged at me by day and disturbed my dreams by night. Old-timers merely asserted cryptically, "They've always been here in these parts." I'd rented a small house for the summer and on the same First Avenue as the sculptures. My objective was to complete my forthcoming book on the subject of personal attacks on opponents in federal politics. I would be free of distractions for the summer, away from my teaching position at Grand River University in southwestern Ontario. However, the Mer people who had always been here in these parts distracted me from my plans. My first thought was I might find information at the local church. Maybe it had records of ancient documents. This idea quickly proved unfruitful. Although the region bordering the Rivière Saint-Anne-des-Monts was settled from the late 1600s, the present neo-Gothic building dates only from the mid-1920s. Alas, a serious fire on Easter Sunday 1937 destroyed the interior furnishings and all of the parish records. What about diocesan records, I asked myself. St. Anne-des-Monts is presently part of the Diocese of Gaspėsie. That ecclesiastical entity was created only in 1922, when the churches of the Gaspé Peninsula were disassociated from the Diocese of Rimouski. I therefore called the officers of the latter diocese, explaining that I wished to carry out some research on the early days of the diocese. I offered my credentials as a visiting professor from Grand River University. That gave me an entree to the diocesan archivist, whom I visited in Rimouski. I found myself in a basement area, among boxes and shelves of very dusty archives. Parish records of baptisms, marriages, confirmations and burials. Much more interesting to me were the assorted documents and letters and records related to when parishes were originally established. But none of them seemed to bear directly on my quest until I came across a file folder marked Relation Micmac, 17e à 18e siècle. This contained a mishmash of conversations, attempted treaties, and negotiations of different kinds. They were very hard to categorize because they were written in Old French, in various styles of cursive script. None of them were familiar to me, but one in particular caught my attention. It was a 3-page handwritten document signed by a man called Godefroy Tremblay, whose family had been very early settlers in New France. The document purported to be an account of a conversation with a Micmac, now Micmac, chieftain. Dated 17th of September 1691, it was entitled Concerning People of a Previously Unknown and Remarkable Species. Because I did not feel competent either to translate or to transcribe such a document properly, I explained my predicament to the archivist. I asked if he would allow me to photograph the pages with my cell phone. I promised I would seek help to obtain the transcription and translation, and would share any findings with him. Returned to Saint-Anne-des-Monts, I contacted the local Société d'Histoire for help. What follows is the translation of the document written by Godefroy Tremblay. It recorded the narrative of Micmac about the real seal men. Whether it represents a Micmac legend that was once in wide circulation, or perhaps a story peculiar to this one particular Micmac chieftain, I have no idea. Translating Godefroy Tremblay's document was not a problem. Monsieur Albert Lenôtre of the local Société d'Histoire accepted the assignment enthusiastically, and within a week he provided me with a typed version of the manuscript. I will let the document speak for itself. The seal men were here since the beginning of time, so we do not know how or where they originated. It seems fanciful to imagine that they were progeny of mating between humans and seals. Perhaps it was simply their own species. Every spring they came to this estuary, where they gave birth to their children on the banks of the river. The seal women stayed with the young, while the seal men swam away to catch fish, which they brought back to share with the mothers. The seal people remained in this locale during much of the summer, teaching the seal children how to swim and how to hunt for fish. By the time the leaves changed colour, they returned to the ocean, and we did not see them again until the following spring. They and we lived peacefully since time began. We could not communicate by words because their manner of intercourse was not like ours. They spoke to each other in rumbling grunts and high-pitched whistles. But lately the seal people have disappeared. This began when the white-skinned people from France arrived on our shores. They brought with them terrible diseases which afflicted both we Micmac and the seal people. First it was the winter fever, which caused us to burn up, yet at the same time to shiver uncontrollably. This would last for many days. Most of us would recover, but some of the old people and the children died. But then there came the spotty disease, which combined the fever with itching sores all over the body. Again, most Micmac people recovered from this disease within several days, or at most after several moons. But it devastated the seal people. Among them, the red spots became runny pus that did not heal. They shivered themselves to death. First year, some of them escaped to the sea, but only a few returned the next spring, and after 2 more springs, they never returned again. I shared the translation by email with the diocesan archivist in Rimouski. His reply thanked me effusively for my trouble. He wished me well for my future endeavours, and hoped to receive a copy of any publication that might ensue. Much more time-consuming were my efforts to determine whether the story of the seal people was part of a common mythology among the Mi'kmaq people. To that end, I contacted every Mi'kmaq community of the Gaspėsie, requesting the opportunity to interview one of their leaders. In some cases, there was hesitation about becoming involved with an Anglophone professor from Ontario, but after several weeks I managed to interview someone from each of the local communities that I could trace. No one could confirm definitively the existence of any such legend, but several people opined that the matter had a certain verisimilitude. In these I documented my interviews with the Mi'kmaq chiefs and background information, and discussions with members of the local Société d'Histoire. Eventually I sent a copy of the piece to a provincial local history magazine, asking whether they might wish to include it in a future issue. Around that time, a quite different distraction interrupted my scholarly activities. My neighbours on First Avenue were a couple named Mermaids, who owned the large house adjacent to my more modest abode. As a stranger in such a rural community, I did not expect to receive more than polite acceptance, but the Mermaids were very welcoming. Daniel and Chantal were an oddly matched couple. Daniel was a lawyer and a notary in the town, a man of charm and sophistication. Chantal was very rustic by comparison. She was younger and spoke in the manner of the villages thereabouts. However, they both made sure that I was comfortable, that everything in my rented accommodation was satisfactory. Also, staying with them for the summer was Yves Bousquet, a friend of Daniel's from his university days. Daniel was at work during the day, and from time to time I would have a conversation with Chantal, who was keen to tell me about local law, including mermaids. She was interested to meet someone from English Canada. She asked me about my job as a professor. It was hard to explain what working at GRU was like to someone whose education had finished at grade 10. Chantal had grown up and attended school some 60 kilometres downriver from St. Anne. Her parents had been killed in an auto accident when she was 8. She was then raised by an elderly aunt and uncle. She'd met Danielle in a manner that seems very quaint today. Danielle had advertised in the disaster newspaper that he was seeking matrimony. Prospects for a young orphan in the tiny village of Gaspėsie seemed limited at best, and Tante Marianne was delighted at the possibility of getting her young charge off her hands and off her payroll. Subsequently, this story began to get fleshed out. Too much information, I would have called it, had I known the French idiom for that expression. To summarize, Daniel was gay. His family either did not know or did not acknowledge his sexual orientation. They repeatedly pressed him to find a nice girl and settle down. Yves Bousquet, his friend from university, was his longtime partner and lover. Inexperienced and unsophisticated Chantal was the perfect consort. Danielle offered her a lifestyle that she could never have imagined in Gaspėsie. Chantal was not completely naive in matters of sex, however. She came, after all, from country folk. First, she could not understand why Daniel was not interested in her physically, but gradually she came to realize that Daniel was not sexless. Rather, he was committed to Eve. This conversation took place one morning in the Normand kitchen over coffee. By this time, things were getting rather overheated, as well as unaccompanied by copious weeping. Chantal began to make it plain that she wanted something more intimate than coffee. She kissed me, she stroked me, she kissed me more passionately. She tried to take my hand and lead me to her bedroom. I protested. She was married, I said. But not really, came the reply. Her lips were full, her mouth was warm and smooth, her dark hair shone. Come, she said, pulling at my hand. And here I made the classic mistake. I couldn't possibly. How could I make love to a woman in her husband's home? Similar to the old story of the car salesman who said, if I said I could have it in red, would you say yes? Because immediately she said, then let's do it at your house. And she led me there. After all, I had by then been celibate for over 2 months, and besides, she was very attractive. So began my affair, my summer distraction with Chantal Mermaids. She told me, perhaps somewhat implausibly, that she was using birth control, and I was happy to believe her. She was an enthusiastic lover. It became a ritual. Each weekday morning after Danielle left for work, Chantal would come over to my house and ask how my book was coming along. If she was truly interested in the answer to that question, I never found out. I was smitten. Chantal would arrive dressed in her housecoat, but nothing else, which she would let fall in a most coquettish manner. She had a wonderful slim body with pert, small, round breasts that rivaled those of the mermaids along the riverfront, size and shapeliness. Add to that smooth skin and dark hair of every description. Underneath her housecoat she always arrived unwashed. When she found out that I liked her underarm hair, she began washing that area the night before and not reapplying deodorant. Let me just say that mornings in bed making love cut into my career as an academic author rather drastically. But I did not object. I began to dream of a life with Chantal, domesticity and children. But when I suggested this to her, she was adamantly against the idea. No, my life is here at St. Anne-des-Monts in Gaspėsie. How could I possibly leave Daniel, who has been so good to me? He rescued me from a life of poverty. What could I ever have hoped for in Gaspėsie? Yes, I know he's not interested in me physically, and I wish that were not so, but think about it. The good outweighs the bad. This has been a wonderful summer for me, but cannot be repeated. It will be forever etched into my soul with love. You know the story of Cinderella, she continued. The reality is that when the handsome prince came, looking for the second glass slipper, there was no way that she would have come forward. In the fairy tale, she and the prince lived happily ever after. But in real life, She was a poor, ignorant and uneducated scullery maid. She could never have fitted into a sophisticated life of a prince and of his courtiers. The evening at the ball had been a wonderful experience for her, but it could not become her way of life. She had the good sense to realize that, so she stayed in the kitchen when the prince came to the house. It's the same for me. How could I, an uneducated and naive girl from the Gaspėsie, speaking not a word of English, fit in with your educated friends and colleagues at the university? They would ridicule me, or worse, pity me. My time with you has been wonderful. It's been my evening at the ball, and I have more than a glass slipper to remember it by. Oui, mon amour, surely you must by now realize that I'm with child. I hope with all my heart there will be a boy. That will make Daniel's family life complete, without forcing him to do something that repels him. You've given me that gift which will make our family whole. But my life is here with Daniel and our unborn child in Anne-des-Monts. Cinderella's prince would have gone on and married a princess, not a scullery maid, and they would have made a good life together. You, my prince, need to do the same. Of course, it should have been apparent to me all along that pregnancy for Chantal would have been a desired outcome of our liaison. More than that, it should have been obvious that Danielle had deliberately turned a blind eye to our affair. But I was in lust. I was devastated. Chantal had become my life, my fire, my every waking moment. This Gaspésienne had completely displaced personal attacks on opponents in federal politics from the centre of my mind. Yes, I'd fiddled around with the text after lunch, after Chantal left, but it would be foolish to pretend that any serious scholarship on the subject had taken place. On our last morning, Chantal presented me with a small gift. In a sealed sandwich bag there was a small lacy handkerchief. Just something to remember me by, she said. It's been inside me all night. I drove away cliche-ridden, heartbroken, sorrowing, tearful, lump in throat. It was a lonely 1,000 kilometres home. But on the way I began to realise that I could not begin to match the wisdom of this unlettered girl and her alternative ending to the Cinderella story. The following summer, I received a letter bearing the postmark of Anne-des-Monts. Inside was a formal invitation to be a guest at the baptism of Henri-Claude Normand. There's also a handwritten note. I hope most sincerely that you'll be able to be with me for this celebration, which will be very important for me and my wife Chantal. With my very best wishes, Danielle. Henri-Claude, my son, though he can never be acknowledged publicly. Daniel Normand was and is his father. I merely supplied the genetic material. I wrote back an effusive note, thanking Daniel most sincerely for his offer and regretting that unfortunately I was the keynote speaker at an academic conference that started that same weekend. Mermaids and other sirens have always been part of the lives and mythologies of those who live by the ocean and those who sail the seas. They lure us and enchant us, but they're not real. Chantal was my mermaid, the siren who called me to perdition on her rocks. I will always remember her and her rocks with great affection. As I was told when I first arrived in Anne-des-Monts, mermaids have always been with us. They will always be with us in our dreams, but just out of reach of reality.